The Toropets-Kholm offensive emerged from the shifting balance on the Eastern Front as the Red Army sought to exploit the aftermath of the Soviet counteroffensive around Moscow in late 1941. In the wake of Operation Barbarossa's rapid advances, the German Army Group Center had been pushed back from the gates of the Soviet capital, suffering heavy losses during the winter counterblows. The Soviet High Command, emboldened by halting the enemy's momentum and eager to sustain pressure before the Wehrmacht could regroup, turned its attention to the northern and central sectors, where the junction of Army Groups North and Center presented a vulnerable seam. The Toropets-Kholm sector, a lightly held stretch of the front in northwestern Russia, offered a rare opportunity. Its sparse German garrisons and exposed supply depots lay far behind the main fortified lines, making it susceptible to a deep strike that could destabilize the entire German rear. For the Soviet leadership, the offensive was a chance to transform defensive survival into a broader campaign of disruption, aiming to fracture enemy communications, seize critical towns, and threaten the cohesion of German positions between Smolensk and the approaches to Leningrad. The geopolitical and military context underscored the urgency of the operation. By January 1942, Germany's strategic goals in the Soviet Union had been thrown into uncertainty. The failure to capture Moscow had stretched logistics and morale, while winter attrition eroded frontline strength. Army Group North remained bogged down near Leningrad, unable to break the city's defenses, while Army Group Center was reeling from Soviet counterattacks that had reclaimed swathes of territory west of Moscow. Between these two commands, the junction zone near Toropets and Kholm was defended by scattered German security units, rear echelon troops, and hastily formed battle groups lacking the heavy weapons and fortified positions of the primary fronts. For the Soviets, this seam represented more than a tactical target. It was a gateway to unhinging the German line in the north, potentially severing the link between major formations and compelling a broader withdrawal. Soviet military preparedness was tempered by the harsh realities of winter warfare. The Red Army had gained momentum following the defense of Moscow, but its formations were still battered, understrength, and reliant on strained logistics. Troops destined for the Toropets-Kholm sector were drawn largely from the Kalinin front, commanded by General Ivan Konev, whose forces had already engaged in heavy winter fighting. Supplies, including ammunition, fuel, and winter clothing, were limited, and much of the advance would need to rely on sledges, horse-drawn wagons, and whatever captured German vehicles could be pressed into service. Intelligence suggested that German forces in the region were overstretched, but the Soviets were aware that rapid exploitation was essential. Any delay risked allowing the Wehrmacht to redeploy reserves and stabilize the line. Among Soviet troops and commanders, morale was cautiously optimistic, buoyed by recent victories but shadowed by the memory of catastrophic losses earlier in the campaign. Public sentiment within the Soviet Union viewed the coming offensive as both a vindication and a necessity. Propaganda framed the operation as a continuation of the momentum achieved at Moscow, a demonstration that the Red Army was no longer merely defending, but seizing the initiative. Yet beneath the triumphant tone, there was recognition of the risks. The advance into the German rear would extend supply lines through snowbound forests and frozen marshes, terrain that could easily entrap overextended forces. For the Germans, the situation was equally precarious. Soldiers along the junction zone, many of them rear-area personnel unaccustomed to frontline combat, faced not only the physical threat of a Soviet breakthrough, but also the psychological strain of isolation as the prospect of encirclement loomed with each Soviet gain. By the eve of the offensive, the stage was set for a confrontation that would diverge sharply from the set-piece battles that had characterized much of the preceding months. The Toropets-Kholm sector promised a test of mobility, improvisation, and endurance in one of the harshest winters of the war. It would pit Soviet ambitions to destabilize an entire section of the front against German efforts to hold a fragile lifeline, all while the unforgiving environment threatened to claim as many casualties as combat itself. In this remote snowbound theater, far from the more famous clashes around Moscow and Leningrad, the foundations were laid for an operation that would test the limits of both armies' capacity to wage war deep behind enemy lines. The Toropets Kholm offensive began in early January 1942, launched as part of the wider Soviet winter counteroffensive following the defense of Moscow. The Kalinin Front, under General Ivan Konev, initiated the operation with the 3rd and 4th Shock Armies as its primary spearheads, supported by elements of the 33rd and 249th Rifle Divisions and various independent brigades. These formations, hastily reinforced and often operating at reduced strength, were nonetheless tasked with a deep penetration into the junction between German Army Groups North and Center. The offensive opened along a broad axis extending from Belly toward Toropets, with secondary thrusts aimed at Kholm, a critical logistics hub and staging point for German operations in the region. The Soviet command hoped to exploit thinly held German rear areas, cutting through garrison towns and disrupting supply routes before reinforcements could arrive. Konev's forces began their advance in temperatures plunging below -30 degrees Celsius, relying heavily on skis, sledges, and horse-drawn wagons to move troops and supplies through deep snow. The initial Soviet movements were marked by rapid gains, as the German defenses in the sector were largely composed of rear area units, field police detachments, and scattered combat groups drawn from security divisions. These troops, unprepared for sustained winter fighting, were quickly overwhelmed by the Shock Army's combined arms tactics, which, though limited in heavy armor due to snow and fuel shortages, employed coordinated infantry, light artillery, and ski-borne units to bypass strong points. Within days, Soviet forces captured Andreapol and pushed toward Toropets, threatening to unhinge the already tenuous German hold on the surrounding region. The element of surprise played a crucial role, as the Wehrmacht had not anticipated a major offensive so soon after the grueling battles near Moscow, believing the Red Army too exhausted and undersupplied to mount another large-scale operation in such inhospitable conditions. The German reaction, though delayed, came with characteristic urgency once the scale of the Soviet thrust became clear. Commanders from Army Group Center, recognizing the danger of a Soviet breakthrough that could sever communications with Army Group North, began diverting reserve battalions and elements of the 16th Army to stabilize the line. These reinforcements, including hastily assembled Kampfgruppen composed of infantry, engineers, and surviving armor, faced immense difficulties in reaching the threatened zone. Roads were buried under snow and ice, vehicles froze overnight, and Soviet ski troops harried supply convoys attempting to reinforce Kholm and Toropets. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe, constrained by poor weather and overstretched commitments elsewhere, provided only limited reconnaissance and air support, leaving ground forces to bear the brunt of halting the Soviet advance. Kholm itself, while not the primary Soviet objective at the outset, quickly became a focal point as Soviet spearheads bypassed the town and pushed deeper toward the German rear. The German garrison, numbering several thousand troops under General Theodor Scherer, began fortifying its positions in anticipation of encirclement, constructing fieldworks and stockpiling what supplies could be gathered. The Soviet leadership, sensing the opportunity to encircle and neutralize a key enemy node, diverted additional units to cut off the town completely, transforming what had begun as a raid-like thrust into a siege operation. This decision, while promising in terms of tying down German resources, also slowed the momentum of the broader advance, as Soviet divisions were drawn into positional fighting amidst deep snow and sub-zero temperatures. The early phase of the operation also revealed the immense strain placed on Soviet logistics. Supply columns lagged behind the fast-moving ski battalions and rifle brigades, forcing many frontline units to subsist on captured German depots or improvised foraging in the desolate countryside. Ammunition shortages became acute, limiting artillery support at critical moments, while frostbite and exposure claimed thousands of casualties on both sides. Yet, despite these hardships, morale among Soviet troops remained relatively high, bolstered by the unexpected ease of their initial breakthroughs and the prospect of cutting deep into the German rear. For the Germans, the shock of the offensive and the growing encirclement threats created a sense of crisis, as local commanders scrambled to hold key junctions while awaiting reinforcements that were slow to arrive. By mid-January, the Soviet advance had reached its first major plateau. Toropets fell after determined but brief resistance, granting the Red Army control over a vital road junction and disrupting German communications across the sector. However, the momentum of the operation began to falter as the realities of extended supply lines, the bitter winter, and increasing German countermeasures took their toll. Konev and his staff faced a difficult balance: continue pushing deeper into the German rear, risking overextension, or consolidate their gains around Toropets and Kholm to prepare for the inevitable counterattacks. The decisions made during this phase would define the subsequent course of the offensive, setting the stage for escalating clashes and the protracted struggle to hold or retake the isolated strongpoints scattered across the snowbound expanse of northwestern Russia. The strategic goals and planning behind the Toropets-Kholm offensive reflected the shifting dynamics of the Eastern Front in the winter of 1941-1942. For the Soviet High Command, the operation was part of a broader vision to turn the defensive victories at Moscow into a wider strategic reversal. The Kalinin Front was ordered not merely to harass the German rear, but to achieve a deep penetration that would sever the vital link between Army Groups North and Center. By cutting through the lightly defended junction zone, the Red Army hoped to force the Wehrmacht into a major withdrawal from northwestern Russia, relieve pressure on Leningrad, and create conditions for follow-up offensives into the Baltic and central sectors. Soviet plans envisioned capturing Toropets and pushing toward Velikiye Luki, while isolating Kholm as a secondary objective to deny the Germans a forward supply and coordination hub. The offensive was meant to combine speed with exploitation, relying on shock armies designed to bypass strongpoints and advance along multiple acts, preventing the enemy from concentrating reserves. For the Germans, the goals were primarily defensive and reactive. The junction sector, though strategically important, had not been heavily fortified, as most resources were focused on maintaining the siege of Leningrad and stabilizing the front after the setbacks near Moscow. German planning, shaped by the assumption that Soviet forces were too exhausted to mount major winter offensives, left only rear area security units, field police, and logistics troops to guard long stretches of supply lines. Once the offensive began, German commanders prioritized the rapid stabilization of the front by holding key nodes such as Kholm and maintaining open corridors for supply and withdrawal. Reinforcements, including elements of infantry and engineer battalions, were redeployed from quieter sectors, but the Wehrmacht faced severe logistical constraints. Winter weather, fuel shortages, and overstretched transport networks hampered the timely arrival of these reserves, leaving local commanders to rely heavily on improvised Kampfgruppen to slow the Soviet advance until heavier formations could intervene. Logistics dominated the operational realities for both sides. The Soviets, while ambitious in their planning, faced severe limitations in their ability to sustain a deep advance. Roads were virtually impassable due to snow and ice, forcing most supplies to move by sledges, pack animals, or captured German vehicles that required constant maintenance in sub-zero temperatures. Fuel shortages were endemic, particularly for any armored units, which were already few in number and prone to mechanical failure in the extreme cold. Artillery ammunition had to be rationed, and units were instructed to scavenge food and fuel from captured German depots wherever possible to sustain momentum. Soviet planners accepted these risks, reasoning that speed and surprise would compensate for logistical fragility. But the strain on forward elements became increasingly evident as the operation progressed. For the Germans, the challenge was to counter the Soviet penetration while keeping their own supply lines functional. The rear areas under threat included critical depots and road networks feeding the front near Rzhev and Demyansk, as well as the tenuous supply routes supporting the siege of Leningrad. German transport columns, already operating at the limits of capacity, now had to navigate through hostile territory, vulnerable to ambush by Soviet ski troops and partisans. To protect these routes, German commanders resorted to forming ad hoc battle groups composed of security troops, engineers, and available infantry, often stripped from other sectors, to guard roads and defend isolated strongpoints. Mines, fortified villages, and defensive perimeters were hastily established to slow the Soviet advance, but the sheer breadth of the threatened area made comprehensive defense impossible. Propaganda on both sides sought to frame the unfolding battle to their advantage. Soviet broadcasts and newspapers presented the offensive as proof that the Red Army had seized the strategic initiative, portraying each town captured as a step toward liberating the Northwest from German occupation. The depiction of ski troops and shock brigades carving through enemy lines was used to boost morale and justify the sacrifices required by the brutal conditions. German propaganda, conversely, emphasized the heroism of isolated garrisons and the resilience of troops holding out against overwhelming odds, particularly in Kholm, which soon became a symbol of defiance. These narratives, while divergent, underscored the escalating stakes of the campaign, as both sides recognized that the outcomes around Toropets and Kholm could influence not only the tactical situation, but the broader perception of momentum along the northern sector of the Eastern Front. By the end of January, the plans of both belligerents had evolved in response to the unfolding reality. The Soviets, encouraged by their initial breakthroughs but hampered by mounting logistical difficulties, began to shift focus toward consolidating their territorial gains and isolating key German positions rather than pushing further into hostile territory without adequate support. The Germans, realizing that a full restoration of the line was unrealistic in the short term, concentrated on holding strong points, stabilizing their flanks, and preparing counterattacks to prevent the Soviet advance from developing into a decisive strategic rupture. These adjustments set the stage for the series of sieges, encirclements, and counter-moves that would define the next phase of the Toropets-Kholm offensive. The first significant engagements of the Toropets-Kholm offensive erupted as the Soviet shock armies, having achieved rapid breakthroughs in early January 1942, pushed deeper into German rear areas and encountered organized resistance around key towns and road junctions. The initial Soviet thrusts had overwhelmed security battalions and scattered garrisons, but by mid-January, the Wehrmacht had begun to consolidate its surviving forces into fortified positions, turning villages, depots, and crossroads into improvised strongpoints. These sites became focal points of heavy fighting as Soviet units, advancing on skis and sledges through deep snow, sought to bypass or eliminate pockets of resistance while preserving their momentum toward Toropets and Velikiye Luki. The contrast in mobility was stark. Soviet infantry, acclimatized to the winter terrain and equipped for ski movement, could maneuver through forests and frozen marshes with relative ease, while German relief forces struggled to move mechanized elements along snow-clogged roads, often immobilized by ice and mechanical failures. The battle for Toropets itself unfolded rapidly. German defenders, primarily composed of rear echelon troops, and fragmented infantry elements were unable to withstand the coordinated pressure of the Soviet Third and Fourth Shock armies. After a series of brief but intense engagements, the town fell, granting the Red Army control over a crucial transportation hub and severing several vital German supply routes. The capture of Toropets not only provided the Soviets with a forward logistics base, but also threatened to isolate larger German formations further west, compelling the Wehrmacht to divert scarce reserves from other sectors to prevent a cascading collapse. Civilians in the area, already enduring the hardships of occupation, faced further upheaval as the front lines shifted. Many fled into forests or nearby villages to escape the fighting, while others were pressed into labor by both sides for constructing fortifications and clearing supply routes. Meanwhile, the fighting around Kholm began to escalate as Soviet forces encircled the town, recognizing its strategic significance as a German stronghold anchoring the defensive network in the sector. Unlike Toropets, Kholm was not swiftly overrun. General Theodor Scherer, commanding the German garrison, quickly organized a tenacious defense using fieldworks, commandeered buildings, and hastily constructed bunkers to create a perimeter capable of withstanding Soviet assaults. The Red Army, while eager to eliminate the pocket, faced mounting logistical difficulties as its supply lines stretched further into the snowbound countryside. Ammunition shortages limited artillery barrages, and reinforcements arrived slowly, constrained by the same frozen terrain that hindered German relief efforts. The siege quickly became a grinding contest, with Soviet forces attempting to tighten the encirclement while the Germans dug in and awaited relief. Unexpected outcomes began to shape this phase of the offensive. The speed of the Soviet advance created opportunities, but it also left some spearhead units dangerously isolated. Several Soviet detachments, advancing too far beyond their logistical support, became vulnerable to counterattacks by hastily assembled German battle groups operating from more stable rear sectors. These German counterblows, though small in scale, managed to disrupt Soviet supply convoys and delay efforts to fully secure captured territory, forcing Konev's commanders to divert troops from offensive operations to protect their flanks and rear. At the same time, the harsh winter conditions continued to claim more casualties than combat in some sectors, with frostbite and disease decimating units as effectively as enemy fire. Morale among the Soviets remained buoyed by the capture of Toropets, but the growing challenges of sustaining the advance began to temper initial optimism. For the Germans, the morale of troops in isolated pockets, such as Kholm, became a focal point for both operational resilience and propaganda. Reports of Scherer's garrison holding out against numerically superior Soviet forces were circulated among frontline units and in German-controlled media, presenting the defense as a symbol of discipline and endurance despite the adverse conditions. These narratives aimed to bolster morale at a time when the Wehrmacht faced setbacks along multiple fronts. Yet for the troops on the ground, the situation was dire. Supplies dwindled, casualties mounted, and relief remained uncertain as Soviet forces pressed their encirclement and sought to expand their territorial gains. By late January, the first phase of heavy engagements had reshaped the character of the offensive. The Soviet capture of Toropets dealt a serious blow to German logistical cohesion, but the failure to quickly subdue Kholm and the emergence of localized German counterattacks introduced friction into the Red Army's advance. The front lines solidified into a patchwork of Soviet-controlled corridors, isolated German bastions, and contested road networks. These developments marked the transition from rapid movement to a more grueling phase of attritional warfare, setting the stage for the escalating crisis that would dominate the middle period of the Toropets-Kholm campaign. As the Toropets-Kholm offensive progressed into February 1942, the initial momentum of the Soviet advance slowed, giving way to a grinding phase defined by attrition, reinforcement, and the mounting challenges of terrain, weather, and stretched supply lines. The early breakthroughs had placed the Red Army deep within the junction zone between Army Groups North and Center, but this very success left forward units exposed, with tenuous logistical support and vulnerable flanks. The Soviet 3rd and 4th Shock Armies, having seized Toropets and cut key German routes, now faced the reality of sustaining their gains amidst one of the harshest winters of the war. Temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. Snowdrifts buried roads and supply tracks, and vehicles froze solid in the night. Horses and sledges, vital for movement, were often exhausted or lost to exposure, while soldiers at the front relied on meager rations and captured supplies to endure the conditions. These hardships undermined the ability of Soviet units to maintain the pace of operations and forced commanders to slow their thrusts toward Velikiye Luki and focus instead on consolidating positions and tightening the siege of Kholm. The Germans, though battered by the initial onslaught, seized the opportunity to stabilize the situation through swift redeployments and improvised countermeasures. Reinforcements trickled in from quieter sectors, including elements of the 218th Infantry Division, engineer battalions, and detachments of the 16th Army, which were formed into Kampfgruppen to contest Soviet control of key roads and delay further advances. These ad hoc formations, despite lacking heavy equipment and suffering from the same brutal weather as their adversaries, managed to launch limited counterattacks against overextended Soviet spearheads. Ambushes on supply columns and sudden strikes on thinly held villages forced Konev's command to divert combat brigades away from offensive operations to guard flanks and secure captured territory. The effect was cumulative. While no single German counterstroke reclaimed major ground, the persistent pressure sapped Soviet strength and slowed their ability to concentrate forces for decisive actions. Kholm, now fully encircled, became the epicenter of this escalating crisis. The garrison under General Theodor Scherer, numbering several thousand troops, fortified every defensible structure, from stone buildings to improvised bunkers, turning the town into a bastion capable of withstanding repeated Soviet assaults. The Red Army, intent on eliminating the pocket, launched successive attacks supported by light artillery and mortars, but ammunition shortages and the difficulty of maneuvering heavy guns through snow-laden terrain blunted their effectiveness. Soviet infantry, often advancing on skis to close the distance quickly, suffered heavy casualties in frontal assaults against entrenched positions. Attempts to starve out the defenders were complicated by German air supply efforts, as the Luftwaffe, despite limited resources, began flying sorties to deliver food, ammunition, and medical supplies to the encircled garrison. These flights, though weather-dependent and vulnerable to Soviet ground fire, prolonged the defense and denied the Soviets a quick victory. The morale of both sides fluctuated as the stalemate around Kholm and along the contested corridors deepened. For Soviet troops, the early optimism of swift victories gave way to frustration as progress stalled, losses mounted, and the bitter cold exacted a relentless toll. Frostbite and disease spread rapidly in the poorly sheltered forward camps, weakening entire battalions before they ever reached the front. German forces, while buoyed by the symbolic resistance at Kholm and the success of localized counterattacks, endured severe privation. Supplies flown into the pocket were barely sufficient, and relief columns advancing from the west found themselves bogged down by Soviet ski patrols and the same winter conditions that hindered all movement. The psychological strain of prolonged encirclement and isolation weighed heavily on Scherer's men, even as German propaganda elevated their stand as a rallying point for troops across the front. Internationally, the Toropets-Kholm sector drew little immediate attention compared to the larger offensives near Rzhev or the battles around Leningrad and Moscow. However, German high command recognized the implications of a sustained Soviet presence deep behind their lines. If the Red Army could hold its territorial gains through the winter and spring, the pressure on army groups north and center would intensify, forcing strategic withdrawals or costly redeployments. This understanding drove the commitment of scarce reserves despite the broader crisis across the Eastern Front. For the Soviets, the inability to decisively destroy the Kholm pocket and expand their breakthroughs beyond Toropets raised concerns that their gains might be temporary, vulnerable to a concentrated German counteroffensive once the weather improved. By late February, the offensive had transitioned from a fluid, high-tempo operation into a static struggle defined by sieges, attritional battles, and logistical desperation. The Soviets still held the initiative, controlling Toropets and much of the surrounding region, but the cost of maintaining their position mounted with each passing week. The Germans, though far from regaining the territory they had lost, had managed to blunt the Red Army's momentum and buy time for their high command to plan larger relief efforts. The campaign had entered a critical juncture, with both sides preparing for the intensified fighting that would mark the peak of the Toropets-Kholm struggle. The Toropets-Kholm offensive reached its peak intensity in March 1942, as both sides committed their remaining strength to decisive operations. For the Soviets, the priority was twofold: to hold the hard-won gains around Toropets, which disrupted the vital German junction between army groups north and center, and to finally crush the stubborn German garrison at Kholm, whose continued resistance tied down entire divisions and delayed Soviet plans to strike deeper into enemy territory. The 3rd and 4th Shock Armies, still the backbone of Konev's Kalinin front, were reinforced by additional rifle divisions and ski battalions to sustain the offensive, despite being underfed, undersupplied, and weakened by the extreme winter. These reinforcements were intended not only to press attacks, but to secure the ever-lengthening Soviet supply lines, which were vulnerable to German raids and the punishing terrain. The Red Army's high command, still intent on translating winter gains into a broader strategic advantage, ordered continued assaults on Kholm and a push toward Velikiye Luki, even as reports of exhaustion and logistical paralysis mounted among frontline units. The German response during this period was equally determined, with Army Group Center and the 16th Army diverting critical reserves to stabilize the situation. Kampfgruppen composed of infantry, engineers, and remnants of shattered divisions were organized into mobile strike forces, aimed at counterattacking isolated Soviet spearheads and reopening land routes to besieged garrisons. Airlift operations intensified as the Luftwaffe expanded its resupply missions to Kholm, delivering food, ammunition, and medical aid despite losses to Soviet ground fire and the ever-present threat of blizzards. Relief columns advancing from the west, though frequently halted by snowdrifts and Soviet ski troops, managed to reclaim portions of key roads and establish tenuous contact with some isolated positions, though the full relief of Kholm remained beyond reach during this peak phase. German commanders, mindful of overextension, balanced these relief efforts with the urgent need to prevent the Soviets from advancing farther west, fearing a breakthrough toward the critical hubs at Velikiye Luki and beyond. Combat during this period was marked by ferocity and improvisation on both sides. Around Kholm, Soviet forces launched repeated frontal assaults, supported by light artillery and close-range mortars, in an effort to breach the fortified perimeter. Each attack was met with determined German resistance, utilizing bunkers, fortified houses, and interlocking fields of fire to inflict heavy casualties. The Soviets adapted by rotating ski battalions to harass German supply lines and isolate smaller outposts, seeking to strangle the garrison rather than rely solely on costly frontal attacks. Elsewhere, German counterattacks targeted vulnerable Soviet flanks and rear areas, exploiting the gaps between advancing Soviet units and their overextended supply trains. These actions forced the Red Army to allocate scarce reserves to defensive duties, slowing their tempo and diverting strength from their primary offensives. The civilian population in the region bore the brunt of this crescendo of violence. Villages caught between Soviet offensives and German countermeasures were repeatedly destroyed or depopulated as civilians fled into forests or were conscripted by occupying forces for labor and fortification work. Food shortages were catastrophic, with stores requisitioned or burned, leaving entire communities dependent on makeshift shelters and foraging to survive the winter. Disease and exposure claimed countless lives, compounding the suffering inflicted by direct combat. For those living near Kholm and Toropets, the battle's intensity turned the countryside into a desolate expanse of wreckage, marked by burnt-out vehicles, abandoned artillery, and shallow graves in the frozen earth. Decisions made by high command on both sides reflected the brutal calculus of the campaign's peak. The Soviet Stavka, despite reports of near breaking point exhaustion among the shock armies, pressed Konev to maintain offensive pressure, fearing that any pause would allow the Germans to re-establish control and launch a counteroffensive once spring thaws arrived. The Germans, facing crises along the entire Eastern Front, prioritized holding Kholm and blocking Soviet advances over mounting a full-scale counterstrike, accepting that other sectors would remain underdefended to keep this corridor from collapsing. This convergence of determination and desperation turned the Toropets-Kholm sector into one of the most punishing arenas of the winter campaign, where neither side could secure a decisive breakthrough. Yet both understood that the stakes, control of a vital junction, and the survival of a key garrison would shape the operational balance in the north for months to come. By late March, the ferocity of the fighting began to taper, not because of any resolution, but due to exhaustion. The Soviets, having expended vast reserves of manpower and supplies, struggled to continue large-scale assaults, while the Germans, though successful in preventing deeper Soviet penetrations, lacked the strength to fully reclaim their lost positions. The offensive's peak left the region devastated and set the stage for a shift from relentless offensive action to a grueling period of stalemate, where survival, attrition, and the looming spring thaw would dictate the pace of events. By April 1942, the Toropets-Kholm sector entered a phase defined less by sweeping offensives and more by endurance, adaptation, and the struggle to hold ground as the worst of winter began to ease. Both the Soviet and German forces, bled by months of continuous fighting and ravaged by exposure, were compelled to shift their focus from aggressive maneuvers to sustaining their positions and preserving combat effectiveness. For the Soviets, the shock armies that had driven deep into the junction between army groups north and center were now overextended, their ranks depleted by combat, frostbite, and disease. Ammunition remained scarce, fuel stocks were critically low, and the improvised logistics network, dependent on sledges, pack animals, and captured vehicles, buckled under the weight of maintaining both frontline units and the besieging forces around Kholm. Soviet commanders, recognizing the strain, reorganized their troops into smaller, more flexible detachments to hold key routes, while ski battalions and reconnaissance groups continued to harass German columns and reinforce isolated forward posts. The Germans, though buoyed by their ability to hold Kholm and blunt further Soviet thrusts, faced their own severe constraints. Relief attempts to break the siege of Kholm stalled repeatedly as mud from the spring thaw transformed snow-clogged roads into rivers of slush, immobilizing vehicles and delaying supply columns. Luftwaffe resupply flights, already strained by losses and weather, were increasingly relied upon not only to sustain the Kholm garrison, but to deliver critical materials to forward Kampfgruppen trying to maintain contact with isolated outposts. Field fortifications, constructed hastily during the height of winter, were reinforced and expanded as German troops prepared for the likelihood of renewed Soviet offensives once the ground hardened. Improvisation became central. Defensive lines incorporated wrecked vehicles and destroyed buildings as makeshift barriers, and engineer units converted local materials into fortifications to conserve dwindling supplies. Partisan activity along the periphery of the contested zone grew increasingly disruptive during this stage, forcing both sides to divert manpower to rear area security. Soviet-aligned partisans targeted German supply convoys and depots, ambushing isolated detachments and cutting telephone lines to impede coordination. In response, German security units and ad hoc patrols combed the forests and villages, often conducting punitive sweeps that displaced civilians and destroyed suspected partisan bases. These operations, while intended to stabilize the German rear, drained resources from the relief efforts aimed at Kholm and from maintaining pressure on Soviet positions, indirectly benefiting the Red Army's tenuous hold on its gains. Resourcefulness became the primary weapon for both armies as conventional resupply faltered. Soviet engineers salvaged abandoned German trucks and artillery, cannibalizing parts to keep a minimal number of vehicles operational for vital supply missions. Troops were instructed to scavenge not only food, but also building materials from ruined villages to fortify their positions against expected counterattacks. The Germans likewise repurposed civilian sledges and wagons to bypass the worst of the mud, while rationing Luftwaffe deliveries to prioritize ammunition and medical supplies for the most critical positions. Despite these efforts, hunger and exhaustion remained pervasive. Reports from both sides detail entire companies reduced to skeletal strength. Their fighting capability diminished more by the climate and scarcity than by direct combat. The psychological strain deepened as the fighting stagnated. For Soviet soldiers, the early elation of cutting through German lines had long faded, replaced by the grinding routine of holding frozen outposts, enduring constant shelling, and fending off probing attacks from German patrols. The promise of further advances toward Velikiye Luki or the destruction of Kholm seemed increasingly remote, and morale waned even as propaganda heralded their continued presence deep in enemy-held territory as a sign of Soviet resolve. For German troops, Kholm became both a rallying point and a source of unrelenting tension, as each week of encirclement brought more casualties, dwindling supplies, and uncertainty about relief. While German propaganda cast Scherer's garrison as a model of steadfastness, the reality for the defenders was one of daily survival, with frostbite, malnutrition, and constant bombardment eroding their strength. By late spring, both sides had largely accepted that a decisive resolution in the Toropets-Kholm sector would not come through continued frontal assaults alone. Instead, the confrontation evolved into a war of attrition, where partisan activity, logistical improvisation, and carefully managed reserves determined the pace of action. Each army, though still committed to eventual breakthroughs, was now forced to prioritize endurance over ambition, bracing for the next phase when the summer thaw and redeployed forces would once again allow for large-scale maneuvers. This period of adaptation, though less dramatic than the offensives and sieges of earlier months, was critical in ensuring that both the Soviets and Germans could continue the struggle once conditions shifted in the coming campaigns. The turning point in the Toropets-Kholm campaign came as the spring thaw progressed into early summer of 1942, shifting the balance from static attrition to decisive operational maneuvers. The Soviets, despite holding Toropets and maintaining the encirclement around Kholm, were nearing the limits of their endurance. The Third and Fourth Shock armies had been ground down by months of cold, disease, and supply shortages, with many rifle divisions reduced to fractions of their original strength. Their artillery, once central to breaking German strongpoints, was immobilized by mud or lacking sufficient ammunition to sustain prolonged bombardments. While Stavka urged Konev's forces to consolidate their foothold and prepare for renewed pushes once the ground dried, the Red Army's forward positions were increasingly vulnerable. Strung out across forests, marshes, and ruined villages, with overtaxed supply lines running through partisan-contested rear areas. This fragility created openings that German commanders, rebuilding their strength as the weather improved, were prepared to exploit. For the Wehrmacht, the gradual hardening of the terrain offered the opportunity to shift from defensive containment to localized counteroffensives aimed at relieving Kholm and re-establishing control over key junctions. Army Group North and the 16th Army coordinated with Army Group Center to assemble fresh infantry formations, supported by what limited armor could be mustered, to strike at the overextended Soviet flanks. Luftwaffe's support, minimal during the worst of the winter, intensified as airfields became usable, providing both reconnaissance and tactical bombing to disrupt Soviet logistics and soften defensive positions. Relief columns, reinforced by engineers to bridge, flooded roads and rivers, launched a series of coordinated thrusts along the approaches to Kholm, aiming not only to break the siege, but to cut off Soviet spearheads that had advanced far beyond their logistical limits. The critical engagements of this turning point unfolded along the roads leading into Kholm, where Soviet ski battalions and rifle brigades attempted to block the converging German relief efforts. These battles were fought under brutal conditions. Spring rains had transformed much of the terrain into bogs, rendering heavy vehicles almost useless and forcing both sides to rely on light infantry and portable weapons. German forces, benefiting from shorter supply lines and improving weather, were able to rotate their units and concentrate firepower, while the Soviets, exhausted and undersupplied, struggled to hold their fragmented lines. Several Soviet outposts, cut off during German thrusts, were overrun, forcing Konev to pull back some forward units to avoid complete encirclement. These withdrawals, though orderly compared to earlier retreats in the war, signaled the waning of the offensive momentum the Red Army had maintained since January. Inside Kholm, the beleaguered garrison seized on the German advances as a lifeline. Scherer's troops, who had endured months of isolation with dwindling supplies, were able to coordinate with the approaching relief forces to launch limited sorties, harassing Soviet positions and creating gaps that facilitated the eventual re-establishment of a tenuous land corridor. Although the siege was not decisively broken overnight, the combination of German relief efforts and Soviet attrition forced the Red Army to loosen its grip, ending the prospect of capturing the town outright. The survival of Kholm, while costly in men and materiel, became a symbolic and strategic victory for the Germans, restoring a measure of cohesion to their fractured lines and providing a base from which to stabilize the broader sector. For civilians in the contested zone, the turning point offered little reprieve. Villages along the relief routes were devastated by artillery and airstrikes, and forced evacuations were carried out by both sides to clear areas for troop movements. Those who remained faced requisitioning of food, shelter, and labor, as military necessity consumed the scant resources left after months of fighting. The receding snow revealed the full devastation of the winter battles: destroyed convoys, shallow mass graves, and abandoned fortifications dotting the landscape, reminders of the campaign's toll on soldiers and non-combatants alike. By midsummer, the Toropets Kholm sector had transformed from a theater of Soviet advance into one of precarious equilibrium. The Red Army retained Toropets and its surrounding territory, but had been forced onto the defensive, while the Germans, though unable to reclaim all their lost ground, had relieved Kholm and stabilized critical lines. The momentum that had carried Soviet forces deep into the German rear during the winter had dissipated, replaced by a strategic stalemate shaped by exhaustion. Shortened fronts and preparations for the broader operations both sides anticipated later in 1942. This shift marked the conclusion of the offensive's dynamic phase and signaled that the contest for the region would continue in a more measured, attritional form, rather than through the rapid breakthroughs that had defined its opening months. As the summer of 1942 unfolded, the Toropets-Kholm sector transitioned fully into a period of consolidation, withdrawal, and reorganization. The Red Army, having driven deep into the junction between Army Groups North and Center during the winter and early spring, now faced the reality of defending an exposed salient that stretched logistics to the breaking point. The Soviet 3rd and 4th Shock Armies, battered by 5 months of attrition, were ordered by Stavka to shift from offensive operations to fortifying their positions, creating layered defenses around Toropets and along the approaches to Velikia Luki. Supply depots were established in forested areas to reduce their vulnerability to Luftwaffe strikes, while engineers constructed fieldworks and corduroy roads to stabilize movement through the marshy terrain. These defensive efforts reflected an acknowledgement that further offensives in the sector were untenable without reinforcements, fresh equipment, and the relief of other fronts drawing German attention away. For the Germans, the stabilization of Kholm and the gradual re-establishment of overland supply lines allowed them to pivot from emergency relief to measured counteraction. Although High Command prioritized preparations for the upcoming summer offensives in southern Russia, the 16th Army and elements of Army Group North were tasked with containing the Soviet foothold around Toropets and probing for opportunities to reduce the salient. Kampfgruppen, supported by Luftwaffe reconnaissance and close air support, launched periodic raids to disrupt Soviet construction efforts and test the strength of their new defensive lines. However, German planners, mindful of their commitments to Case Blue in the south, avoided committing large forces to a full-scale counteroffensive, instead opting to harass Soviet positions and wait for a more favorable strategic moment to reclaim the lost ground. The gradual easing of combat intensity did not eliminate the suffering of soldiers or civilians in the region. Both sides relied heavily on requisitioning food and shelter from the local population, leaving entire villages stripped of supplies. Civilians were frequently displaced, either by deliberate evacuation orders to clear zones for fortification or by the destruction of settlements caught in artillery exchanges. Disease spread rapidly during the humid summer months as standing water from the thawed marshes became breeding grounds for illness, further straining the already fragile medical systems of both armies. The psychological toll of the prolonged conflict lingered among the local populace, many of whom had survived the winter battles only to endure occupation, forced labor, or ongoing displacement. For Soviet troops, the withdrawal from forward positions around Kholm and the shift to defensive postures was a sobering reversal. The triumph of the winter advance, once hailed as a sign of the Red Army's resurgence, had given way to fatigue and caution. Units that had once surged forward on skis and sledges now dug trenches and constructed bunkers, waiting for the next phase of the war rather than pushing it further west. Morale, while buoyed by the retention of Toropets and the disruption of German communications earlier in the year, was tempered by the recognition that the broader campaign had failed to achieve a decisive collapse of the German line or the destruction of major enemy forces. The German defenders, though heartened by the survival of Kholm and the stabilization of their junction sector, found little respite. Constant partisan attacks on supply lines, the threat of renewed Soviet offensives, and the need to hold an extended front with limited manpower kept their forces under strain. Luftwaffe resources, increasingly diverted to the southern front, left ground units with minimal air cover, forcing them to rely on field fortifications and mobile patrols to maintain control of the region. Even as the immediate crisis subsided, German commanders were acutely aware that the Soviets, once reinforced, could again attempt to exploit the vulnerabilities of this junction zone. By late summer, the Toropets-Kholm sector had settled into a tenuous equilibrium. The Soviets retained their salient and the strategic road junction at Toropets, while the Germans, having relieved Kholm and shored up their rear areas, contained the threat without committing to a costly counteroffensive. Combat operations dwindled to patrol clashes, artillery duels, and sporadic air raids, as both armies redirected their focus to more decisive theaters: Stalingrad and the southern steppes for the Germans, and the defense of critical northern sectors for the Soviets. The withdrawal from large-scale fighting left behind a landscape scarred by months of devastation. Its forests and fields littered with wreckage, abandoned fortifications, and mass graves, a stark testament to the cost of a campaign that had shifted from rapid advance to protracted stalemate. The Toropets-Kholm offensive, though overshadowed by larger and more famous battles on the Eastern Front, left a lasting imprint on the course of the war and on the region it engulfed. Strategically, it demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of the Red Army's emerging winter counteroffensive capability. The operation had begun as a bold thrust to exploit the seam between Army Groups North and Center, and for a time it achieved results that reverberated far beyond the immediate sector. The capture of Toropets and the deep penetration into German rear areas disrupted logistics, forced the diversion of reserves, and weakened German control over critical junctions in northwestern Russia. It also compelled the Wehrmacht to commit resources to relieving Kholm and stabilizing their line at a moment when manpower and supplies were strained across the entire front. Yet the offensive's inability to translate its initial breakthroughs into a decisive encirclement or destruction of German forces highlighted enduring Soviet weaknesses: logistical fragility, the lack of sustained heavy support, and overextension in hostile terrain. For the Germans, the campaign underscored both the dangers of underestimating Soviet resilience and the Wehrmacht's capacity to adapt under duress. The near collapse of the junction zone revealed how vulnerable rear areas could become when lightly defended and when weather and overconfidence delayed reinforcement. Yet the successful relief of Kholm, sustained largely through improvisation, air supply, and the stubborn defense orchestrated by General Theodor Scherer, became emblematic of German tenacity during the harsh winter of 1941-1942. This defense, widely publicized in German media, was used as a morale-boosting narrative, portraying the Wehrmacht as capable of holding against overwhelming odds despite the deteriorating situation elsewhere. Militarily, it bought the Germans time to consolidate their lines, preserving the link between Army Groups North and Center and allowing for a gradual recovery in the sector as spring approached. Culturally and politically, the legacy of the operation diverged sharply in Soviet and German memory. In the Soviet Union, the Toropets advance was framed as part of the broader narrative of recovery after Moscow, proof that the Red Army could seize the initiative even under the most severe conditions. Propaganda emphasized the capture of Toropets and the deep penetration of German lines, while the failure to take Kholm and the eventual stalemate were downplayed. After the war, the campaign received less prominence than battles like Rzhev or Demyansk, but it was acknowledged as a stepping stone in the evolution of Soviet operational art, particularly in the use of shock armies and ski-mobile units for deep winter strikes. In Germany, the defense of Kholm became legendary, celebrated alongside the more famous Demyansk pocket as an example of discipline and sacrifice. Scherer and his men were heralded as models of endurance, their ordeal immortalized in post-war accounts as a testament to the Wehrmacht's fighting spirit, even as the campaign itself marked a period of mounting strategic strain. For the civilians of the Toropets-Kholm region, the aftermath was marked by devastation and hardship that persisted long after the front lines stabilized. Entire villages had been emptied or destroyed during the months of shifting control, their populations scattered by evacuations, forced labor, or flight into the forests. Fields lay fallow, infrastructure was wrecked, and the remnants of fortifications, wrecked vehicles, and unexploded ordnance turned the landscape into a hazardous wasteland. Recovery would be slow, hindered by the continued proximity of the front and the need to prioritize military logistics over reconstruction. The scars of the campaign, physical and psychological, lingered among those who had endured the brutal winter, the bombardments, and the repeated displacements caused by the ebb and flow of the fighting. Historically, the Toropets Kholm offensive stands as a case study in the complexities of mid-war operations on the Eastern Front. It revealed the evolving capability of the Red Army to plan and execute deep winter strikes, while exposing the persistent vulnerabilities that prevented such offensives from achieving decisive outcomes in 1942. It also highlighted the Wehrmacht's ability to recover from sudden crises, leveraging improvisation and air mobility to sustain isolated forces and hold critical junctions. Though it did not decide the fate of the war in the North, it shaped the operational environment for months to come, forcing both sides to divert resources and adapt their strategies. In the broader historical record, the campaign remains a reminder that many of the critical struggles of the Eastern Front were not grand, sweeping battles, but grinding operations in remote sectors, where survival, logistics, and endurance mattered as much as tactical brilliance or numerical strength.